Okay, sir, we are live.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Welcome, sir, to this talk that we have designed. Like the main purpose of the talk was like we were like all in home. So I thought of like if we can get people engaged in like most of them were trying to know a bit of herpetology and other thing as well. So as you know, we had started with Bharatgiri, then we had Vogel sir, then Shoibal sir, and today it's you. And thank you so much that you gave us the time.
Sure, I'm
So
happy to do it.
thank you, sir. So at the very beginning, that we have a simple format that everybody I ask the same question because there will be many new to this field and they want to know how to. They are a little bit messing around the things like as what happened with me, how to go about the thing, how to start. So you started when you started it off. Like it, what was the year?
Well, I actually knew that I wanted to do something in herpetology when I was 5 years old. Um, I didn't know how you made a living out of it, but
Yeah,
I knew this is what I wanted to do, and
but
so
and why is that, sir? 5 year child.
I think I lived near New York City,
Yes,
and
sir.
we had the American Museum of Natural History, huge natural history museum nearby, and they had wonderful herpetological exhibits, and I was just fascinated. And I also caught my first green snake when I was 5 years old. Um, and in Eastern North America, we only really have one genus with two species that's brightly colored of snakes. And I caught one when I was 5, and I thought, oh, this is the most interesting animal I've ever seen. Um, so luckily, nobody ever told me no. Nobody ever said this is a bad idea. Everybody encouraged me, and so when I went to university eventually, um, my first course that I took in biology was comparative anatomy, and the instructor talked about amphisbaenians on the first day of class, and I thought, oh, this is fascinating, and that convinced me even more this is what I wanted to do. And then I just started specializing, reading everything I could, and then recognizing that it was going to be important to get into a good graduate program eventually if I wanted to do this for a living. Um, so I was pretty single-minded about it. For many years, I kind of knew this was what I wanted, and when I learned about anatomy and then about systematics, I realized this is what I want to do with reptiles. I knew I wanted to work with them, but I wasn't sure what way to take. And then when I started taking these courses, it opened my eyes to the different ways that you could ask questions, and kind of led me down the path that I eventually took.
So, sir, in the Western countries that you have a subject, most of them, most of your America and all other have this herpetology specialization or something like that. But in countries like India and most of the South Asia, we do not have a subject which is dedicated to herpetology.
Mhm.
So I believe such interaction and outreach program would be very important to get people motivated. And do you think because of that, the number of description, like in America, there are yesterday or day before we were discussing like subspecies concept. So there were like in America, there are lots of subspecies of snakes and Europe too. But in India, we hardly have. Is it because that we are lacking in manpower to look in details into the whole group?
I think certainly in part that's true, because if people don't know about something, they're not going to get interested in it. And uh, depending on where you are in India and what your opportunities are, you might never really be exposed to herpetology in any way. And so you can't really expect people to have an inherent interest if they never are never exposed to these things. So I think in part that's the case, that historically uh, India and South Asia in general always suffered from manpower in these areas. And the really encouraging thing for me is in the last 10 or 15 years is really the first time when I look at India that I see many, many people across the country who are pushing herpetology forward, which never really existed before. If you go back to 1970 or 1980 even, you really just had a few government herpetologists and a few other people who were working in a few institutions, but a very small number of people. And now, you look across the country and you see people in every state, and you see people at many universities who are taking advantage of the fact that more is being done, there's more being published, there's accessible books, which didn't exist. There was Malcolm Smith's book from his books from the 30s lasted for ages and ages, and it's really only been in the last 15 years that there are many sources available in multiple languages that make herpetology accessible to people.
But on the same side, do you think, because I want to, because I know you are not active in social media much, but because since many of my friends and we maybe you have stumbled upon some of the photograph, the herpetology has gained momentum in India. That is true. But in other hand, there is certain, like, as you said, you started off with snakes. So for some reason, many of us, all of us, started somewhere down the line with a snake, and then we diverged more academically into different streams. So there are, in on the hindsight, there are some abuses in mainly with snakes, like nowadays, because nowadays people are more into catching snake. Even they are rescuing snake from where it's not at all necessary to rescue snake. It's somewhere in the natural habitat. So there is a big problem now creeping up, that what to rescue, and it's always better not to rescue. So what is your response to that? Is it same in America as well?
I mean, I think it's a little different here. I mean, we don't really have things like snake rescues, which are a big thing in India. They're a big thing in South Africa and other places, partially just because the density is lower, and the density of people is a bit lower. And so the interactions are not, we don't see so much interaction. But that's true. A little bit of knowledge can be a dangerous thing. So you have people who are well-meaning, but maybe are enthusiastic, but maybe don't have enough training to know when is the time to leave them be and when is the time to intervene. So that's certainly a problem. I was just going to mention, by the way, that I know here why I was interested in snakes is an interesting thing in the eastern U.S. is we have almost no lizards, but we have plenty of snakes. So as a child growing up, you're much more likely to run into snakes if you live, especially in the northeastern U.S. So I didn't really see a lizard in the wild until I was about 10 years old and visited Florida.
So Florida, I think those population are somewhere introduced, I think, some of the gay.
So in Florida, you've got a couple of very common native species, but you also have many dozens and dozens of introduced species. It's sort of the climate is just right. Almost anything will live there. But many of the species are also very, very limited. They do well, but after 30 years of introduction, they still occupy a tiny area. They may still only be in an area of one town or even just a few blocks within a town.
I remember you told about Baltimore, some geckos are there and they are living at the same place for ages.
Yes, this is the thing. I mean, in eastern North America, the only native gecko is only found in the far southern part of Florida. But now that same gecko that I talked about years ago, now 11 years ago, I think probably,
Yeah.
that was in Baltimore, has now moved even further north. So this is an introduced gecko that was introduced about 100 years ago and now is in 27 of the 50 American states, and has expanded, but rather than expanding little by little, moving from Baltimore to Philadelphia to New York, they get new introductions. They come in with packages, they come in with plant material, and so they end up forming little spot areas where they become common. And then you will find none for 100 kilometers, and then there'll be another little population.
So if you remember that we did a paper on Flavivirides long back in 2011, that Flavivirides from commercial areas of Guwahati, that Guwahati, Assam was not in range. Now that was only in the commercial area, and now I have to add that they have spread into the residential area as well.
Mm.
So we are getting more of Flavivirides, and this smaller one like Frenatus and Brookie, somewhere they are getting lost in the time.
Mm.
So so as you say, like since we had this conversation, like Baltimore came into the point. So what is the coolest region that till date, because geckos are in more in temperate and tropical region, so what is the coolest area that till date you have found geckos, and what was the temperature like?
Um, there's a couple of places. I mean, if you go very far south, so at the south end of New Zealand and at the south end of South America, you get native geckos, which can tolerate quite cool temperatures. But they're more sort of a maritime climate, so not a very hard continental climate with very cold winters. Um, in terms of Central Asia, you do get species that get up quite far north into southern Russia, in areas that will have very cold temperatures in the winter. And then the introduced species here, we now have them as far north as New Jersey, which will typically have winter temperatures below -10. Um, so we see those, and then we also see some that are having a different strategy. Those geckos live in cold areas, but at the cold times of year, they're usually not very active. But in the Namib Desert, in Southwest Africa, I've collected geckos at about 6 degrees centigrade, and they're active. So I think between 6 and 9 is the lowest temperature I've ever seen active geckos. But I've
Okay.
certainly seen geckos that live in places that drop down to -10, even -20, but they won't become active until the temperatures rise up.
So as we now we want to know, like since we are using the term gecko once again and again, so I would like to know, sir, what makes gecko a gecko? What
So,
defines a gecko?
so it's a really good question. And of course, the things that people think of when they think of geckos are actually not the things that all geckos share. So people tend to think of geckos as being active at night, and about 70% of geckos are nighttime active geckos, but not all. People think of geckos as climbing, having toe pads, and being able to climb vertically. Um, Again, most geckos do that, but there's still about almost 40% of geckos that can't climb. So the things that people mostly think of are not universal. What comes close is having no eyelids. And most geckos, the vast majority of geckos, lack eyelids. Their eyes are permanently open with
Open.
a clear a clear brill over them. But there are exceptions there too. So eyelid geckos, like leopard geckos, which of course occur in India, are the exception to the rule because they do have movable
Yeah.
eyelids. So the things that really make geckos are mostly internal features. So I won't go into a lot of detail, but gecko skulls are actually more like snake skulls than other lizards. So they've lost some of the bones in the skull that give them greater flexibility in the skull. And that is something that in lizards is extremely rare, and geckos are where you would look for that. So a lot of features that geckos have are would apply to what you see climbing the walls around your house, but you can always find exceptions. But this lack of a particular set of bones in the back part of the head, that's something that really is unique to geckos.
And sir, just to elaborate, what is the name of that particular bone?
So this is the upper temporal arcade. So in most lizards, you have two sets of openings on each side of the head. In crocodiles, for example, if we go outside of lizards, those two sets are complete. There's bone around each of those openings. In most lizards, you have a set up here with bone all around it, and then below you have an archway, but it's open at the bottom. In geckos, even that upper part is opened up. So the whole side of the skull, because of the loss of this postorbital bar or the upper temporal arcade, that's lost, and it gives geckos this very open look. When you look at a gecko skull, it looks very lightly built because it's lacking this outer part of the back part of the skull.
So, as since we had this point, like geckos are climbing, and many people attribute that factor of geckos being able to climb as one of the important identifier. So, basically, there are many misconceptions regarding how geckos even climb a vertical surface or upside down climb. So, what is actually the science behind this feature?
So for geckos to be able to climb, of course, a lot of lizards can climb, but the one thing that geckos can do that other lizards can't is to actually go completely inverted and kind of run across the ceiling. So, of course, they're going to use claws if they have them, so that's one thing. But the important difference is the toe pads, and on the toe pads, you have an elaboration of what are tiny little spines that are all over the skin, very microscopic. But on the toe pads, these are expanded into elongate structures called setae, very hair-like structures. And at the tips of these, there are little flat areas like a spatula. And these areas then, which have a very, very tiny surface area, contact very intimately the surface that the animal's working on, what the animal is climbing. And we have van der Waals forces, which are taking place. And van der Waals forces are forces that are at a very tiny level, very tiny forces that involve intermolecular interactions. So it's almost as if the toe of the gecko is, for a very brief time, in a very brief, very small area, physically fusing with what the animal is walking on. So,
So, sir, I have just shared the screen. If you can see, there
right.
is that the smallest unit there. Are they the CTs, sir?
So in the panel C that's in the upper right there,
Yes.
you can see the fields of the CT, and then in
Okay.
E below it, you see a close up of the tips, and it's
Okay.
really those individual tips that are the
Yeah.
key. That's the important part. Um, and we know that geckos are over designed. We know that geckos can support a much greater weight than they actually have. But because surfaces, even what we perceive as being very smooth surfaces, in fact, at the scale that these structures are built, these surfaces are really rough. Even something like glass
Glass.
is
Yeah.
a very rough surface when you look at it microscopically. And so those little pads, only a tiny fraction of them actually are engaging with the surface. So even though something like a big gecko, like a tokay gecko, can support many kilos of weight, in reality, on a natural surface, it can only support maybe a little bit more than its own weight. Um, but it's these intermolecular forces, these so-called van der Waals forces, that are really critical for geckos to hold on. And they also use just regular friction as well. So you'll see geckos put their bellies and the underside of their limbs on the surface as well, so they have friction to help them hang up as well. But we can
So
see, for example, like big geckos don't run, and probably many people will have experienced this. Geckos bigger than a certain size are not so good at running on the ceiling, and they fall down on your plate while you're
true,
eating.
true.
Um, so only really small geckos can generate enough force, because these forces are so tiny, so that when they're completely upside down, they can actually run. Bigger geckos can maybe hold on, but once they try to move, there's a good chance they're going to fall in your soup.
So how big a gecko can become? Like which species? Like
So um, the largest living species is from New Caledonia. It's an island off the coast of Australia, and the biggest one I've ever seen was 600 grams and 250 millimeters in length. That not including the tail.
same.
So this is a gecko that is kind of the size of a kitten or something. It's a big lizard. Um, and there are a few other geckos that approach that size, but that's really exceptional. But we do have one gecko that probably is now extinct, um, known from a single stuffed specimen. The body length was 370 millimeters, and it probably weighed more than 2 kilos in life. Um, and that
New
seemed to
Zealand,
be
I think.
the biggest.
I think it was from New Zealand, sir.
Right, right. It was the first gecko I ever described. I started with an easy one.
So that was described by you.
Yes, yeah.
I need to go back and see that. So since we were talking a lot about the toe pad, so does all the geckos have this classical toe pad? As you say, they may not have. So what? Once I heard you, or I heard in evolutionary stretch story, they have lost once, and again they have gained it.
Right. So because geckos are covered with these little spines, these little spinules all over the body, these microscopic ones, that's really the key. If you have those, you can build the toe pads. So geckos have gained and lost again and again the toe pads, but they've always kept these little spines on the skin. So they keep the building blocks that you need to eventually make a pad. So when we say that the toe pads have evolved again, that they've evolved multiple times, really we're not saying that they evolve out of nothing. They evolve from this structure that they have, a sort of pre-adaptation, something that is too small to help in adhesion. But once it gets a little bit bigger, it starts to have this role, this benefit that allows the animal to attach to the surface. So we know that there's been multiple cases of the evolution of these and multiple cases of the losses. But that ability to gain the pads is all dependent on having this pre-adaptation, this specialization that doesn't function for adhesion, but can be elaborated to function in that way.
So any other group other than geckos have this toe pads?
So there's anolis lizards in the New World, which there are hundreds of species. Um, they have these toe pads, although they're not as complex as gecko pads. And so anoles are not good at running upside down, for example. They're not very good at hanging upside down. They're very good climbers, but they have shorter setae, which are less subdivided and have fewer of these attachment points. And so they're not quite so good at it as geckos are. And then there's a small group of skinks that are also capable of doing this as well.
So, as we in our house lizard, and most of us are familiar in India that geckos are calling at the evening, early evening. So, does all the gecko do all the gecko make this vocalization, or there are some which have no vocalization at all?
So all geckos can vocalize in terms of a defensive vocalization. So any gecko, if you pick it up and squeeze it, is likely to make a little squeaking noise to get you to release it. But in terms of more social calls, where males are trying to attract females or males are confronting other males, those calls, which are more complex, we see them in almost all the gecko groups But for example, eublephaриds, the eyelid geckos, do not make those kinds of noises. And diurnal geckos do not generally vocalize. So
They do not need it.
yeah, it's mostly restricted to the nocturnal species. So there are some exceptions, but this is why, at night, if you go out places with geckos, you will hear the geckos calling, but you're not going to hear those same geckos calling during the day. Even if they were awake during the day, these diurnal geckos are not really capable of making those sounds.
So, as you just said, that is a male territorial call, or it may be something to do with female attracting female. So, is it like female do not call at all?
Um, it's variable. There are some species where females can call, but typically the females either don't call or they call with less frequency, or they call with less obvious calls, very low, quiet calls. But for example, in the mourning gecko, which is mostly distributed in East Asia and in the Pacific, it's an all-female species. And so these are rather quiet, but because you have no males, they interact with each other and they can vocalize and communicate.
So since you say that all female, so you are actually meaning the reproduction process through parthenogenesis. So,
Right.
like not having a male, I heard that you told that in an island population, it gives a very good chance of like only one gecko can colonize the whole entire. So this is a very big benefit. But on the hindsight, there is no variation. So that is a problem that they have to deal. So do you think like this, since if it was so successful, so most of the lizard would have been like parthenogenetically evolving, but I think that there are some problems, that's why so we have this the lizards which are like more of sexually reproducing. So do how many of the all the global population of geckos or species, how many actually are reproducing through the process of parthenogenesis?
So there are about 1,940 species of geckos today that we've described. And of those, probably something in the neighborhood of 20 species are parthenogenic. So it is, as you say, something that has quite a high cost to it, because evolutionarily, no variation, and then you have no ability to respond to changes. So, often people refer to these animals as being weedy animals. They're essentially the animal equivalent of a weed. They're very good at getting into places. So they establish themselves in places that are disturbed, that might not be good for something that needs a primary habitat, needs a nice pristine habitat, or they get onto islands where there are no competitors. And so being an animal that is not a great competitor and can't respond to evolutionary pressure is still a pretty good strategy if you're the only gecko in town. If you're the only lizard on an island, you can make do with this. And so most of the species that we see that are parthenogens are specialized on either islands, or they're species where we see they have a wide distribution, but often in disturbed areas, often in urban areas or areas that have been influenced by typhoons or cyclones and are have the complex habitats destroyed. They will get in early, take advantage of the fact that nobody else is there. But then once the habitat gets complex, or once you get new invaders, they don't compete that well.
So I have a counter question to that, because one, as you just compared this parthenogenetic geckos with weed, like many people think in that term. So there is this parthenogenetic gecko in this northeastern part of India, that is Hemidactylus garnoti.
Mm-hmm.
So this garnoti is the wherever garnoti is present, they are the least sighted gecko.
Right, and we have the same thing at the other end of its distribution in New Caledonia. Um, the same thing. In many years of working there, I have seen maybe 6 of these, whereas the other sort of typically bisexual geckos, like Hemidactylus frenatus, I would see hundreds for every
Yes.
one of the Garnoti. So Garnoti is sort of a difficult one to explain. Um, and it may be in part that when you look where they often occur with other Hemidactylus geckos that are more aggressive. And within Hemidactylus, there's a tendency for aggressive species to actually move into urban environments and do well. And it may be that sort of the reverse is true, that Garnoti gets left behind. It can only survive in places where it's not going to be seen because it's not really aggressive or competitive enough. But it's a very interesting case because it and 1 or 2 other Hemidactylus that are also parthenogens are kind of the exceptions to the rule there.
So, so, so as we had this question, like I have been asked again and again, because we are going from one extreme to another. So also climate has a lot to do with distribution of gecko and weather climate of a particular place. So how do you like all the studies now are now have a tip of like they want to get to a point where climate change can be associated with it, because they can be an indicator, so as to say how. So how are geckos responsive to climate change?
So geckos are, on the one hand, very good indicators, and on the other hand, very bad indicators. Um, they're bad indicators because nocturnal geckos are usually active at temperatures that are lower than they prefer. So, in fact, with mild climate change, with climate change 1 to 2 degrees centigrade, they actually will experience temperatures that are closer to their preferred temperatures. So there's a chance that in the short run, geckos, nocturnal geckos anyway, might benefit from climate change, while most day active lizards, including day active geckos, will suffer from this change. So on the one hand, nocturnal geckos are kind of an exception to the rule because they are active at temperatures that are cooler than they would actually like. On the other hand, although the geckos that people in India, for example, would see, the average person who's not a herpetologist, right, is going to see just one of a handful of species of pretty common, widespread house geckos or geckos that are kind of widely distributed. But when we look across geckos as a whole, the vast majority of all geckos actually have very small distributions. So if you take a look in the Western Ghats, or you look in the Eastern Ghats, or you look in any area that you've got elevation, most of the species, in fact, will occur only in a very small area. And those are good models for looking at climate change, because in those areas, we have an animal that is limited to very specific sorts of environment, and sometimes at elevation. And so in those cases, changing climate will tend to push those animals higher and higher in elevation. And
Yes.
because if we look in, for example, the Eastern Ghats, if we look in the Eastern Ghats, we have elevations that are not all that high, right? You have higher, the higher elevations are still, in comparison to the Himalayas or in comparison to real mountains, these are relatively low hill ranges. But you still have animals that are adapted to those situations. And so even a small change in climate may force them high enough up that they run out of space. If we have a climate change of 2.5 degrees C, that may be enough to force some of these species that are limited all the way up to the tops of the mountains or the tops of the hills where they occur. And if the temperature goes up anymore, they either have to adapt very quickly, which may not be possible, or
Die
we're
out.
going to lose those species.
So since we are discussing on little bit, you told about species diversity and how climate change can, in fact, negative way they can impact the diversity of geckos. So I have a little bit of data, and I will talk to you because Atlas of Life, you are a part of that study. Atlas of Life. So all the vertebrate, I think they made an atlas, and so we will discuss a bit about Atlas of Life and what it says all about. But I saw in the reptile, the number of reptile that you describe is round about. I may be wrong, but it's round about 205 species.
Yeah, I think it's up a little bit. That was the end of last year, and I've got a few more, so it's around 220 right now.
So, okay. So it's like 220 or something around. But the most interesting fact that I collected was all 50% of this work. But you started back in what you first described the species in which year, sir?
1986.
So if you think your career started from 1986, but 50% of the species you described in last 10 years, last 2010 to 2020, that is 105 species you have of reptiles you have described since 2010. So to be precise, 2019 was a peak with 20 species. 2014 had 23 species. So in 1 year, in 2014, you described 23 species. So why, what you attribute this huge number coming in last 10 years?
There's a couple of things. I mean, one is just as I've gone on in my career, I have more and more students and colleagues and collaborators in different places, and so that, of course, gives me access to more material. The other thing is, one thing that we didn't realize is that some of the really hyper diverse genera of geckos, so things like Cerdidactylus, Nemaspis, and Hemidactylus, we didn't realize how limited so many of these were in area, and especially for something like Cerdidactylus. We now know that almost every karst tower, if you go to Myanmar or you go to Malaysia, every separate karst tower will have an endemic Cerdidactylus. In India, we used to think that there were something like Hemidactylus maculatus widely distributed. The more we know, the more specimens we get, the more widely we sample, the more we realize that very few of these geckos are widespread. They're nearly all limited to particular areas. And so in the last 10 years, my colleagues and I have made a real effort to try to get to any isolated hill range, any isolated mountain range, any isolated valley, any place that is geographically separate from the areas around it, because we know now that almost every one of those areas, if it's occurring in the tropics or subtropics, is likely to have its own species, its own endemic species. So that's sort of a big change. And the other thing is, we're now using molecular methods, and in the past, we might have a hard time distinguishing, is the variation we see just variation within a species, or is it in fact something that means we have multiple species? And with good genetic data, we're now able to use that in conjunction with the morphology and say, yes, not only can I see some differences here, but genetically, these lineages are separated by 20 million years. So we know that these are going to be separate species. So in part, it's access to locations, in part, it's new technology, in part, it's more and more international collaboration. And I think all of those things contribute.
So, sir, on the here you told about centralized population of geckos throughout different type localities or different small areas. Now, on the hind side, the geckos which are spread across the world. For example, if I take Hemidactylus frenatus, which is one of the most spread out geckos in the world. So, my question is, do you think like the population which has colonized in America and in the right opposite part of the globe. Like for example, if you come back to India, so do you see a genetic difference large enough, or is there a gradient of genetic differences throughout the range?
There's sort of a gradient of differences, and what you see when some of these in widespread species is really not so much genetic differentiation, but what you see is that they have plasticity. You see that these are animals that once you move them to someplace else, without any genetic change, they're still able to change the rate at which they lose water. They're able to change their temperature tolerances. And so, in many ways, these things that have the wide distributions are the true generalists. They have features that mean that you don't have to have speciation in order for them to adapt to new places. You can keep the genetics you have and just modify how you respond as you travel to these different areas around the world. So Hemidactylus frenatus, there are at least 2 or 3 species that are within what we would today call Hemidactylus frenatus, but each one of those has a wide distribution and very little genetic differentiation within it. So they've been successful by being kind of physiological generalists rather than speciating to deal with new challenges.
So I'll before I want to go to this molecular thing that we were discussing, but before that I want to go to one of the stories that I think many of us would like to hear: the geckos in the seashell, the geckos that can rip off their skin and then get
Uh,
out of hand.
yeah, so this was something that was reported in the literature, but only a few times. But when you work with some of these geckos, and there's a gecko in the Seychelles Islands that is really quite extreme, if you do what you would normally do to catch a gecko by hand and be quite gentle with them, as soon as you touch them, they spin in your hand, putting friction on their own skin, and they rip their skin off. And they're able to rip off about 40% of the skin on the body and still survive. Um, and we've since found this in other animals. Now, some geckos, the skin is a little fragile. For example, Gahyra mutilata, the skin will rip, but not to this extreme. But it occurs in different parts of the world. And all of these animals, we think that it's evolved probably 8 different times in different groups of geckos. And when we look at it, what we see is their skin is built uh, in 2 layers. The upper layer is only loosely attached to the lower layer. And so when that upper layer rips off, we're left at least with a thin, transparent, protective layer. And also, the dorsal part that rips off, the outer part of the skin, is like postage stamps. They have zones inside of them that have weakness, automatically built in weaknesses.
Yes.
So just a little pressure in the right place, and the skin will pull apart. And then it's really pretty spectacular because if you think about humans and if you think about burns or other severe skin wounds to people, if we could figure out how it is that these animals can lose 40% of their skin and all they need to do to survive is essentially remain someplace where they have some moisture so they don't dehydrate, and eventually in a period of weeks they will begin to redevelop the skin. So I think that there's this is a real case where geckos could tell us something if we had people with a medical interest who were interested in this as well. I think we might be able to find something that might be able to benefit people.
So, do you think this is something of an anti-predatory behavior of the gecko? Maybe monkeys and all catching them, and they are running off their hand by doing the same ploy.
Yeah, so my theory about this is if you are a gecko and you're attacked by a bird or a carnivorous mammal, usually the first contact that that predator makes is going to pierce your body wall and will kill you. So a successful attack is a fatal attack. But with monkeys and other primates, or with large arthropod predators like big spiders, scorpions, and even potentially with snakes, often the predator has to manipulate the gecko first. It grabs the gecko in the case of a primate, or a snake may pin the gecko with its body before it actually is able to bite it. Or in the case of a scorpion, it might grab with its palps before it stings. And so all of those opportunities allow you, if you have this rip away skin, allows you a chance to escape. Whereas if it's a predatory bird, the beak is just going to pierce the body and you're dead. So this handling, this additional handling that some predators need, is I think what may be driving this particular adaptation in geckos.
Because we wanted to get back to the molecular thing, genetics. So a few days back, I went through a paper, which I hope you have gone through that, which says that the way the molecular assessment has been done, there is quite likelihood that in future there will be many more synonymy, the species which are now based on molecular, entirely based on the see. I have my own logic or my understanding, like even if we take Cetodactylus, and there are, like for example, the first question is like, if I do a pairwise distance, p distance, so how large should be the, many of them have already sent me this question, how large should be this p distance to qualify to become a separate species?
So certainly those p distances are quite informative, but I would never rely entirely on those to determine what's a species. So of course they're going to change depending on the gene you look at.
Surely.
So with mitochondrial genes, there's still quite a difference depending on which gene you're looking at. But divergences for the gene that I mostly use, which is ND2, if we see differences that are in the range of, let's say, 7 to 9%, so 7% or above, that's usually pretty unambiguous. That is usually going to be associated with a clear set of morphological differences. It's going to be associated with geographic differences. Usually that's a very safe sort of number. If we go below that, we run into in between cases. So between, let's say, 2% and 6%, in some cases, you would look at the overall situation and say, look, this has a wide range. So if there's 400 kilometers between here and here, a 6% difference may not mean much in terms of species. But if I have two taxa that are 50 kilometers apart, appear to be isolated, let's say on mountains, have maybe a very small morphological difference, but a 6% genetic difference, that might mean something, because 50 kilometers is not that big a space, not that big a distance. So if you are 6% difference across 50 kilometers, that may suggest that there's little or no gene flow. And although you may look rather similar to your relative, you've been going on this divergent pathway for some time. You've been clicking along, changing genetically, slowly but surely, and beginning to diverge with one another. So you never really want to use those p distances by themselves as evidence. And even a very low p distance, under some circumstances, may be representative of different species. And the best example is if we look outside and look at fish. If you look at the African Rift Lake cichlids, those cichlid fishes, we know that there may be as many as 1,000 different species that have evolved in the last 600,000 years. So under some cases, we tend to think that we're going to see genetic differences that mirror morphological differences. In some cases, we have genetic distances or genetic differences that are quite large, and the morphology is very similar. But we occasionally have the opposite, where the morphology is already very different, but we have almost no genetic distance between these animals. So the lake cichlids are a very great example of this, where we know that they've evolved in very short period of time, but there's very little genetic differentiation. Yet you look at the animals and you don't need to be a specialist to see that this one and this one are completely different from each other. So, you know, we really, after all this time, we still don't really know the relationship between the genetics and the morphology, right? Because we look at markers, genetic markers, but those markers usually have nothing to do with the morphology that we use when we're trying to describe species. And so you may have a mismatch. You may be the case that the gene that you're looking at shows very little differentiation, but it's not the gene that's responsible for what's making these organisms
Variation, yeah.
looking different. So it's a very complicated point, and I think that, you know, the trend these days is to use something called integrative taxonomy, and I think that integrative taxonomy is definitely the way to go, where in order to make a decision, you use multiple lines of evidence. So it may be molecular data and morphology. It might be morphology and the calls of the geckos. For example, if we have two geckos that look very much the same but have very different calls, the calls are how they're going to recognize each other. So that may be more important than the morphology. So using multiple lines of evidence, I think, is the way that we move forward in systematics, is to say, let's make sure that we've looked at the different things that might explain this. And I should say that for Cerdidactylus, which we now have 300 species of Cerdidactylus, and I had a great worry that many of these, because they differ often on tiny color pattern differences, were maybe not good species. And there's now been at least 2 big studies that have looked at those and found that for the vast majority of those, even if the genetic differences were not that large, when we look at them in an integrative context, most of them seem to be supported. Most of them seem to indicate that once these animals got isolated, they lost contact with their relatives, so we now have no more gene flow, and we're now beginning this process of divergence. And really, in a way, once you start to diverge, you're on that path to speciation, and it's really almost an arbitrary thing. When do you start to call it a species? When is it a species in the making, and when is it already an established species? And that's going to be an argument that I think people will continue to have for a long time to come.
So since we had this some discussion on evolution as well, so I just wanted to know because, for example, the minimum time scale to find out, you need to have some gecko which you have like did some radioactive carbon dating or something to find out the age of that gecko, and then we can put the data set and get the idea that what is the recent, as I can understand, I may be wrong, but what is the oldest gecko that you know of, or fossil or something like that?
So it's difficult to know with these older fossils to be sure whether they are true geckos or maybe gecko-like relatives. Probably the best old example we have is Eichstedtosaurus, and there's a species from Germany and another species that was also from Europe, and they are about 150 million years old. They come from the one from Germany comes from the same place, the Solnhofen, that Archaeopteryx comes from. So at 150 million years old, the skeleton of this animal looks very much like a modern gecko. But there's one thing that differs, which is it doesn't have, or it does retain, I should say, a pineal frame. It has an opening on the top of the skull that modern geckos don't have. We're now working a lot with amber preserved geckos from Myanmar, and these are 99 million years old. And we now have more than 15 individuals representing mostly different species from that time frame. And there we now have, finally, we have more or less complete skeletons, plus we have animals with the skin. We even had some with the soft tissue. We have animals where the tongue is preserved, muscles are preserved. So those animals, although they may not be representative of living geckos, are certainly true geckos. They are certainly, they may represent a now extinct group of geckos, but they are certainly part of true geckos. And so we know 100 million years ago, we have true geckos with certainty. 150 million years ago, we probably have the precursors to geckos, or at least the very close relatives of geckos, but they didn't quite have all the gecko features quite yet.
So as we had so many, you told us that Cetrodactylas and lots of speciation and 300 species, and most of these 300 in 50% or more were described in last decade. So my question is, in coming decade, because many of the viewers would like to know how they can contribute and what is the scope. So do you believe in coming decade we will see even a bigger surge of species being described, at least from this region, South and Southeast Asia?
I think so. I think, especially in India, I expect that there will be, we will find additional species. There are still areas that have not really been explored herpetologically, or have very poor herpetological investigation, and especially for geckos, because somebody can go out during the day and either something that's conspicuous and diurnal or something that's big, you will see. But you really have to go out and look for geckos. If you're going out, you need to be out at night and you need to be looking in the right places. So I think that we're going to see that in northern India, there'll be more species. In northern India, where you have the meeting of Cerdidactylus, which is sort of the great tropical southeastern geckos, and then the naked-toed geckos, which are the great radiation of sort of the Middle East, where they come together in Pakistan and in northern India.
So you are talking about Cetopodium.
So Cerdipodion and its relatives. So this is, I think, an area where we will find more in India. And it's also the case still that the Western Ghats and the Eastern Ghats are still undersampled for geckos. Even though there have been many new species found, we're now discovering that things like Hemiphyllodactylus, those little tiny geckos, are also very diverse. And we didn't really know that before. Now we know to look for those, and so we will find more and more of those. So, I think that, and I can say that in terms of what people who are not specialists can do, I have described several species, and I have a new genus of gecko that I'm describing from the South Pacific that somebody sent me a photograph of. That's how I first learned about it. Somebody sent me a photograph and said, "What is this?" And I got the photograph, and it's like, that's a new genus. There's room for citizen science if people are able to take photographs of things and have them geo-referenced. If they can send information, photographs with geographic information, that can be very, very useful, because even somebody who may not be a specialist but lives in a particular area and is there all the time, they're going to have a better chance of running into something than somebody like me, who is going to come on a field trip, and if I don't see it in the 2 weeks I'm in an area, I'm not going to find it. So I'm becoming a bigger and bigger fan of citizen science, and I think that people can really contribute if they're able to do things like that, to take photographs of anything they see that they think is out of the ordinary, anything that's not the house gecko they're used to seeing. That could be a very useful thing for people to do.
So the last sentence you were emphasizing on looking for geckos. So actually, as a general person, where should I look for a gecko? we have lost him. We can again
Yeah.
get him. Huh.
So, um, so I think the places to look are, again, these widespread geckos. They're going to be mostly tolerant of places that are everywhere, of human mediated environments. But any place where you can get that is isolated, certainly if you're on trails that take you into a more isolated area, uh, many geckos congregate where there is a resource they need, which is often an egg laying site. So places that have caves, places that have overhanging rocks, places that have deep crevices are all places where one might expect to find kind of new and different things. Looking in the canopy, most people, when they go out at night, if they're in a forest, they look at eye level. They look at things that are 2 meters high. They don't look at things that are 18 meters up into the trees. So if you've got a good light, a good torch that you can use to look in those sorts of places, the places that people normally don't look, and so these are things that we pass every day. People who are bird watchers or people who are enjoying the outdoors, who are doing the sort of things probably that many people are doing on a day-to-day basis. If they think about where would somebody not be looking, that's where these animals are going to be. So if you just sort of look out of the ordinary, if you just look for that quiet little spot between two boulders or that kind of thing, that's, I think, the sort of places that one can look. And yes, hill ranges and mountains are going to be more likely places because people haven't looked so much there. But even in other areas, for example, in Indonesia, we're finding many new species that are in Java, in this hugely populated island, in agricultural areas, but nobody had ever looked before. So if you're in a place where people are not active, where you don't have a local herpetologist, where there haven't been a lot of descriptions in recent times, it may partly be because the area doesn't have very much, but it may also be that the area just hasn't been explored, even these everyday sort of places.
So I have is there any gecko that you have ever found have close association with water, like aquatic sort to say?
In fact, this new genus that I'm working on now from the Pacific, we had been in the area where it occurred in 1990, but we never saw it. And it's a big gecko. It's as big as the biggest Indian geckos, and we have never seen it before. And it turns out we'd never seen it because it lives on boulders in the middle of streams. So it has to cross water to get to these boulders. And when we look at the diet, it includes things like aquatic beetles, as well as more terrestrial insects. Um, and there is at least one species that I know that is undescribed that is in Myanmar that does something quite similar. There is another species in New Zealand that will, when it perceives danger, it will jump into the water and go to the bottom and hold on to rocks so it doesn't float up again. It's a rare, very rare ecology to have, but there are some geckos that do it.
And because nowadays we are more into urban biodiversity study, because urbanization will be the rule of the day in coming days. So have you in a larger scale, have you ever seen into that aspect where geckos have changed some of their, like, which is evolutionary, like a sort of speciation to say, because of the pressure of urban or anthropogenic stress?
Um, I mean, of course, it's a new enough problem that we wouldn't have seen very much change, right? Even if urbanization is intense, you're looking at, in the grand scale of evolution, you're looking at a very short time period. Um, but we do see species, for example, that seem to be specialized now, that no longer occur in in native habitats. They only occur in urban situations. So clearly, some species are able to take advantage of this, and in fact are uniquely urban species. Uh, and then we see changes in other ones, some of which may be plasticity, but some of it may be evolution, maybe have an underlying genetic basis for it that suggests that things are changing. They're learning to deal with, and learning in quotes there. They're learning how to make do in environments that are very different. Although, as you well know, urban environments often can provide everything they need, right? It may not be what they're used to, but there's food, there's shelter, there's opportunity if they are either flexible enough behaviorally or they can evolve quickly enough to take advantage of these new and different sorts of environments. But you certainly, one can certainly see that a house provides everything a gecko really needs to live. It's just, can it figure out how to use those resources?
So now we will, sir, I'll take some of the questions that already have been sent. So Bharat Giri says, without Aaron, Indian herpetology will surely be different. You are the source of inspiration to many. I am one of them. Thanks, Aaron, for being there.
Well, that's very nice. And
So I'll show you something on that line before we take the next question. So you have to, if you can remember this, I just want to say, because as what Bharat say, I feel the same, and it's like more like a fan relation to you. So I have something for you, if you can remember this. So can you remember this?
yes, I do remember those. Yep.
So it was in 2009 that you left them in India, and I
Yep.
kept them. Yeah. So yeah, though they are big enough for do not fit me at all. So so next, could you just okay? Then Avrajal Ghosh asks, if possible, can you talk little bit about what does it pronounce? Pygopodidae.
Okay, about Pygopodidae.
Okay, what's that? I don't
So
know.
this is there are the way that we classify geckos now. There are 7 families of geckos, and one of them is limbless, and that's
Okay.
the Pygopodidae, which is
Okay.
in Australia and in New Guinea. And of course, their life is very different because they have no limbs. Some are burrowing, but most are surface active. Most are active at night, although some are day active, but they're mostly active at night in low grasses and bushes in Australia. One of them gets very big. One of them actually gets to 3/4 of a meter in total length. But of course, because they're long and slender, they're not going to be as massive as the largest climbing geckos. Um, but the very interesting thing about them is it turns out that when we do molecular or when we do morphological phylogenies, when we try to recreate the tree of life, most things that are reduced limbed or limbless, like snakes or amphisbaenids or skinks that have lost their limbs, are so heavily convergent with each other. They are so they've sort of moved towards a common body form, and because of that, these phylogenies can be fooled and they'll just lump everything together. But pygopods still are clearly geckos, even though they lack the limbs. They still have the very large gecko eyes. They lack the eyelids, and the skull looks like a normal gecko skull. And so, even though these animals have adapted an entirely different lifestyle, they still are geckos. You still recognize them as being geckos. Whereas it's quite easy in some of the limbless skinks in some parts of the world are so snake-like that without picking them up and looking at them, you might be fooled. But a pygopod is a still a gecko, and just really fascinating animals. I've been doing a lot of work in Western Australia, and I'm always excited when I find pygopods.
So whenever most of the time I mail you, your mail says once you are back you will mail, and most of the time your answer is I'm in Australia. Many of that.
Yes, it's sort of a. Until coronavirus, I was sort of splitting my field time mostly between Southern Africa and Western Australia, and then having trying to get to India. It's been a while since I've been in India, but I've had some more recent trips to Borneo and other places in tropical Asia. But when travel restrictions are lifted, um, I will be back in India, and I'm looking forward to getting to all of the places that I enjoy coming.
So please keep a slot for Northeast as well.
Yes.
Yeah. So then Abhijit Chakravarti asked, a gecko from Madagascar, I forgot the name, the gecko throws a silk type thing when threatened from the body. Is it?
Yeah. So there is again in Australia there are Stropurus geckos, and in New Caledonia there's another gecko, Eurodactylodes, um, which secrete this sort of sticky material, which is sort of fibrous and stringy, that is a defensive thing. Doesn't seem to be toxic in any way, but it's been proposed that this sort of material might be useful against things like spider predators. So for geckos that live in the leaf litter that might encounter large-bodied spiders, this might be something that actually prevents them from using their chelicerae that will essentially clog up their mouth parts and be an effective way to get escape. And this has got a bunch of interesting questions associated with it, because geckos that can produce this, they do it more at lower temperatures, because at higher temperatures they're able to run away, and they would prefer to do that. But at low temperatures, if they feel that they can't escape, they can use this approach to secrete something that will either distract or in some way prevent a predator.
So, sir, the next question comes from Tushar Abhyankar. He says, is parthenogenesis also lost and gain feature during evolution?
Um, we don't know of any cases in geckos where it's been regained. So we have independent derivation again and again, but we don't know of any cases where that's been lost and the lineage has gone back to being a sort of more typical one. And you might imagine that that's the case. Again, if we think of them as weeds, they only last so long. You might actually predict that these are species that are going to be successful for a short period of time, and that might be thousands of years, but not millions of years. And they may go extinct when they have to deal with competitors and a more complex environment. And then it'll pop up again somewhere else in the world where it's advantageous. You'll have this happen, because all of the cases we know in geckos are the result of hybridogenesis. So some geckos, when they hybridize, will tend to produce these parthenogens, and we see it in just a few lineages, just a few genera. But within those genera, it's likely that it happens again and again and again. So it's unlike a lot of things in evolution. It's probably a case that it only goes in one direction, and we don't get any reversals.
So, in to add to that question, I also have a question. Like, have you accounted for the cases where two closely related species are breeding among themselves, geckos?
So it turns out that even distantly related geckos that are separated by as much as 20 million years in some cases, can actually interbreed. Um, so they retain some genetic compatibility. But the way you have to look at this is to say we should expect that that's the case. That's an ancestral trait to have this compatibility. So geckos are evolving away from this ancestral situation. So many geckos, even though they've clearly speciated, even different genera can still interbreed with each other. What counts is not that they can, but if they do. And in fact, in the wild, it's quite rare. I only know of maybe 10 situations where there is a real hybrid zone between two related geckos where it seems that they are interbreeding. Sometimes you may get individuals who interbreed, but evolutionarily it's not very important. They interbreed and either they produce no young, or if they produce young, the young don't survive. But there are just a few cases that we know of where hybridization is occurring and may be important evolutionarily.
So then, Banani has asked you, what are the things that we should take into consideration or note down when we see a gecko in the wild or wherever they see gecko?
So I think, the most important things are, you don't want to disturb the animal if you don't have to. And generally, of course, you'll probably be violating some law if you are kind of handling animals. So if you can get as close as possible so that you get as good a photograph as possible, certainly having the information, the geographic information, what are the coordinates, what are the GPS coordinates for where the animal was, time of day, temperature, elevation, those are all kind of important things to record, whether the animal was calling or not. And that's a great thing too. If you have a cell phone that you can take photos with, you can probably also record calls with. So if you see an animal that's calling, that could be a very important thing. Getting as much of the body as you can is important. So oftentimes a tail actually has a lot of useful information on it. So if you can get a shot that has the whole body, or multiple shots in which you can get a view of the back, a view of the tail, a view of the head, more is always better there, because it may allow a better chance at identification.
So Prajwal has almost the same question. So natural history, almost same you have already discussed. Shonak has asked you, what does it mean if you have examples which have strong morphological difference but shallow divergence? So it has already been discussed, as you have told that fish example you have given. So uh, we are just going through only one question for per person because there are a lot. So Arnav asks you wait. Arnav asks you, how do you feel about the approach of molecular lineage, I think, geckos regenerating with that of other higher vertebrate, and the probable use of the knowledge in the field of regeneration and stem cell biology. I think regeneration, tail related question.
Right. So, I mean, of course, most lizards are also capable of regeneration, but geckos, in addition to being able to regenerate tails, can regenerate the skin, as I talked about in the case of these animals that have the ability to give up large parts of their skin. So I do think that there's, it's an underexploited area. It's the sort of thing where people have traditionally used amphibians to look at regeneration studies. And in many ways, of course, they may be better in the laboratory because you can raise large numbers in aquaria, that sort of thing. But of course, even though they're very distant from us, geckos or any lizard are much closer to us evolutionarily than any amphibian is. And so, using reptile models in the study of regeneration and potentially stem cell research, I think is not a crazy idea. I think it's something that is worth looking into.
So R. Chaitanya is asking, is it right to use the fossil group from Myanmar, including Cretaceous gecko Burmese, as a crown geckoton, or should it be used as a stem group? The placement of the fossil changes and the age of the diversification within the genus by about 30 million years, and therefore the question.
Yeah, it's an excellent, a pretty technical question, but a very excellent question. And this is why we're really excited that lately, I was just in December, I was in Bangkok looking at new amber fossils in a collection there. And we're really excited about this because when Cretaceous gecko was described, this was the first one of these 99 million year old geckos in amber. It was just a foot and a piece of tail. That's all that was preserved. So we knew that it had toe pads, had gecko-like toe pads, but that wasn't really enough to tell us whether it was a crown group gecko or whether it was a stem group gecko. We now have enough material where we have skulls and we have skeletons and soft tissue, and we now have enough that we're working on that I think we'll be able to place those geckos into a tree. Once we place those into the tree, we will end up with much better time trees for geckos because we will be able to distinguish whether this is sister group to all the living geckos or whether they're embedded somewhere within the living geckos. And it could go either way. We know that the slightly older geckos from the Gobi Desert that are rock fossils are probably stem geckos. But these ones are very, very similar to living geckos. And I'm guessing we're sort of stuck now. We've done CT scans of all of these specimens. When we analyze those, which I think we'll do as soon as the ability to travel and get into our labs again is open to us, I think in very quick order we should be able to analyze these new fossils, and I think they will give us that answer. So, yeah, that's a great question.
So this is the last question. Arpita asked, geckos will learn how to adapt with she's talking about urbanization and anthropogenic stress. Geckos will learn how to adapt with it. So my question is the learned behavior be passed to the next generation, that is heredity? I mean, do this learned behavior have any relationship with genetics?
Yeah, that's a very good point. At some level, it certainly does. I mean, at some level, you're going to find that these animals that are more successful in the urban environment are going to have a selective advantage. And so you're going to get changes in gene frequencies that are going to relate to their ability to deal with these. So, just through the normal process of natural selection, one would expect that these animals that have variable behaviors would either maintain that variability and be able to be successful in multiple places, or if they're now limited to urban environments, that you may see selection driving them towards behaviors that are especially useful. So, we don't know very much about the heritability of a lot of gecko behaviors, but certainly some of these behaviors will be heritable, and so there will be a genetic component.
So, sir, we have like exhausted all of the question, and we are running out of time as well. We have gone to more than 1 hour 20 minutes now. So you can just be online, sir. I'll just end the broadcast, and then
Okay.
I will get back to you. And for all of us who have, I think all of us have been benefited by this talk, and I am really thankful to you, and all of us, in fact, thankful to you that you managed time for this type of a talk. I was just thinking like if you will be able or not, and it made our at least it made my day. So
Okay.
thank you,
Well, I'm glad to hear that, and I really enjoyed it. It was fun.
thank you so much, sir. Thank you.